Hello and welcome to today's webinar. We're going to be talking about folic acid. My name's Carolyn Ladowski and I'm the founder of MTHFR So we've spoken before about the importance of folate, but what I really wanted to hit home in this webinar is what form of folate is best for us and what do we need to do to ensure that we are getting the right form of folate? So when we say folate, it is an umbrella term. It's actually a very confusing term because even in the literature in medical journals, you'll see that there are different forms of folate and they might say one and mean another. But essentially, the three forms are folic acid, folinic acid, and 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. And you can see from their structure that they are actually quite similar. But where they really differ is this tail group where we actually have our carbon units attached. And so it is important that we understand the difference. And folic acid is basically man-made, it's synthetic, and it has no physiological function in the body unless it's converted to dihydrofolate. And we'll see in a minute why that is important. But I think one of the key things we must note is that the folate receptor that sits on the surface of the cell will actually prefer to bind to folic acid rather than our natural form of folate, which is our dihydrofolate or folinic or methylfolate. So in a way, what it's doing, if it's not being converted, is blocking our natural forms of folate. And I know that a lot of you have seen some of this research, but for those of you who haven't, then I think it is important to understand that this enzyme called dihydrofolate reductase, which is really responsible for getting that folate into the cell and then making sure it's converted, is actually slowed down by folic acid. It says we observe that folic acid is an inhibitor of dihydrofolate at certain levels. And what the study goes on to say is that about 200 micrograms of folic acid is where we start to see this slowing down and this inhibition of the key enzyme. From a fertility standpoint, this particular article in Human Molecular Genetics absolutely blew my mind because the standard protocol, and many of you would know this, for IVF fertility centres for high-risk pregnancies or high-risk individuals for miscarriage is 5 milligrams of folic acid. Now that's 5,000 micrograms. And this study said that contrary to expectations, high-dose folic acid supplementation resulted in a global loss of methylation. So in other words, what we need to happen to ensure good DNA and good sperm motility and production and everything else, we've got to have methylation. But folic acid actually reduces it. And then it goes on to say that for those who had the MTHFR gene, it was even worse. But it doesn't mean that even in those who didn't have MTHFR gene, it still resulted in a loss of methylation. And that's important. So it's promoting 10 times higher dose of folic acid. It's inducing significant global loss of sperm methylation, which is then passed on to the offspring. And most of that loss was in those people that were homozygous for the C677T. And it then went on to say that we believe that this loss of methylation may cause neurobehavioral disorders like ADD, ADHD, autism, etc., etc. Who knows, depression, anxiety could also be characterized under that neurobehavioral disorder. So I think this is a really important point, is that just because we've always used folic acid, it doesn't mean that it is necessarily the right thing to do. We also see studies like this coming out that's saying we're a bit worried about this folic acid fortification. If we're increasing unmetabolized folic acid, so that's the folic acid that is sitting there and not going into the folate pathway because it can't, then perhaps that's a problem. Perhaps, as is said, we need to be concerned about the amount of folic acid that people are actually getting in their diet every day. Folic acid, again, another story about the fortification and public health. It says here, our findings suggest that persons exposed to 100 micrograms a day or less are unlikely to have unmetabolized folic acid in the serum. But if you go to 200 or 400, then that's a different story. And this unmetabolized folic acid is building up and has been linked to varying different conditions like decrease in natural killer cells, cancer, a whole lot of other things. They're saying that the elevation in folate, and predominantly they are checking folic acid, is a problem. They've even linked it to autism. So I don't think we can say categorically that folic acid is okay. And particularly for those with MTHFR, I would go so far as to say it's not. This one looked at folic acid supplementation in those that had the MTHFR gene and IVF outcomes. It's their conclusion: high folic acid intake and MTHFR gene variations seem not to be associated with helping women to achieve pregnancy. Well, of course, because we're actually using the wrong form of folate. And from my clinical experience with the patients that I help to fall pregnant, this is what I'm seeing again and again and again. If you get good doses of methylfolate, our active folate, and reduce folic acid, there is often a positive outcome, even if you do nothing else but take folic acid out. So our second form of folate is folinic acid, also known as calcium folinate and 5-formyl tetrahydrofolate. Unlike folic acid, it is metabolically active. It's found naturally in foods, and it's a really important substrate to help with this folate pathway and regenerate things and get things moving. And I'll show you what I mean. So here's our folate pathway. Imagine this is the surface of the cell. Your folate receptor sits up here and it sees folic acid and goes, great, thank you. I'm going to bring folic acid into the cell. But remember we said that this dihydrofolate reductase enzyme only copes with about 200 micrograms of folic acid a day. Now, the research says that they believe that most people that have a standard American diet, which is bread for breakfast or cereal, lunch, maybe a sandwich, and then pasta or something like that again at night, then they're maybe taking a multivitamin, they suppose that it could be as high as 1,000 micrograms. So what happens when you have over 200 is you actually inhibit dihydrofolate reductase. And the theory is that unmetabolized folic acid is increased. So if we're slowing down dihydrofolate, it means we've got a block in the pathway. And we cannot then make tetrahydrofolate, and we cannot make 5,10-methylene tetrahydrofolate, which is the step before us making methylfolate. So here's your MTHFR gene, and it takes 5,10-methylene tetrahydrofolate and converts it to methylfolate, which can then be used in the body to support DNA, RNA, proteins, and lipids. So that's really crucially important that we remember this. And so here's our 5-formyl tetrahydrofolate, that's our folinic. And you can see here that folinic is really instrumental in helping, because this is a very dynamic pathway, it's not static. And tetrahydrofolate gets converted to 5,10-methylene tetrahydrofolate and vice versa. 5-methyl gets converted back to tetrahydrofolate, and this cycle goes and moves constantly. But we don't want to be using something up here when it potentially is slowing down a key enzyme in the pathway to create tetrahydrofolate, because our end objective is to create 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate, because it's this folate that goes on to support SAM, which does all this. And this is one of the reasons why women and men miscarry, is because the DNA was not sufficient. So, anywhere up to about 12 weeks, we've got to consider that DNA is an issue. And without enough methylfolate, we're not going to have good levels of our DNA. So methylfolate, it is our active form. It's what we need to be producing for great fertility, and it is affected by the MTHFR gene. And sometimes as much as 70% is not being converted. Remember, we said that this lack of folate is really linked with a whole lot of different issues as far as fertility and preconception go. Not only neural tube defects, but the quality of the sperm, the quality of the egg, clotting disorders, behavioural issues like autism, ADD, ADHD, allergies, low birth weight, multiple miscarriages, autoimmune, and really it goes on and on. And remember, we also said that if DNA is really governed by folate, we then consider how important this strategy is to A, get rid of folic acid, and B, make sure we have enough methylfolate. And remember too that the healthier your MTHFR enzyme is, so in other words, the more folate and the less stressed someone is, and the less, detoxification issues, the less the baby is affected by the MTHFR gene. And essentially, if we have good levels of folate, that's what's going to occur. So it really is one of the most crucial things. And what's really exciting about this is when we're looking at it from an epigenetic point of view, the risk completely goes away when you ensure there is enough folate in the body. So that's awesome. That's what we want. That's what we need. And the research also says that when you have good folate levels, really there's very little congenital anomalies. So it's the most important thing. So then if we say, well, okay, folic acid is out, what we need is folinic and 5-methyl. So how do we do that? And how do we get it into our bodies? And how do we avoid folic? So essentially, if we're avoiding folic acid, it means that anything fortified with folic acid has to go. And in the US and in Canada, that's happened since about 1998, and in Australia since 2004. Why did they do it? Because they wanted to make sure that those people who couldn't afford a supplement were actually getting enough levels of folate, and in this case folic acid, to stop neural tube defects. Has it done that? Yes. But have we created other problems in doing so? Perhaps. So the things that we need to be aware of and get out of our diet completely is anything made from a commercial bread flour. So breads, buns, focaccia, muffins, flatbreads, the domestic flour that you buy for bread making. Cereals. So most of the cereals on the supermarket shelves are fortified with folate, and in this case, folic acid. Flours. In the US, cornmeal, pasta, rice, and other grain products. Essentially, if it has the word folate or folic acid, you need to avoid it. And if it's in there, they have to, by law, say that it is in there. But they will say folate, even though it is folic acid. If it says folate, be sure and be rest assured that it is only folic acid, because we cannot from a supplemental point of view, put in folinic or methylfolate because they're just so unstable and it would not last in a packaged good. So this is from a organic bread flour, and you can see there it does not say folate. Therefore, we can be sure it does not contain folic acid. And of course, we know that our leafy greens do not contain folic acid. So you have to look at the labels. Now, in the case of organic bread, there is no ruling to say that they must use folic acid. But where it becomes complicated is it's up to the manufacturer. So if the manufacturer says, well, yes, I'm going to add it, then it must be on the label. Again, if it says folate, it has folic acid. Bread flour made from other cereal flours like rice, corn, or rye, again, don't have to, it's up to the manufacturer. Essentially, if it has wheat in it and it's made commercially, it must have folic acid. But the other manufacturers, if they don't put it in, then it's not going to be on the label. If they have put it in, it is going to be on the label either as folic acid or folate. Bread shops. So if you go to your local bread shop, obviously the breads sitting there are not in a packet, so you don't know. It's again their option, and if they're using commercial bread flour, it will be in there. If they're not, and they are more of a boutique organic sort of bakery, it's again their choice. So you have to ask them, and by law, they must tell you if it contains folate. If it says folate, it contains folic acid. Again, our fresh fruit and vegetables and our legumes do not have folic acid. They are naturally occurring folates. And there are different forms. So essentially, methylfolate, tetrahydrofolate, and folinic occur naturally in our foods. And so our leafy greens and cruciferous vegetables like our cauliflower and broccoli and cabbage will all have methylfolate. Berries and broccoli and sprouted legumes all have methylfolate. But there are other foods that are high in folate, but not necessarily in methylfolate, like our legumes. So chickpeas, beans, lentils, etc. are high in folate, but it's mostly tetrahydrofolate and folinic. So it still has to be converted. So you're better to use sprouted legumes and broccoli and your leafy greens to get your folate levels. If we look at the daily allowance of folate, you can see here that even at birth, we need 65 micrograms a day. So if you are breastfeeding, you must have 500 micrograms a day, and we hope that 65 of that will go through to the infant. If you are not feeding, then it's going to be very hard for you to find a formula without folic acid, one of the hardest things. And so you're going to have to really think about what you're going to do. Often the level of folic acid in a formula is really, really low. So, for a child, if it's under, say, 75 micrograms, you should actually be fine, but you have to accumulate the number of bottles they're having. So breast obviously is best, but we understand that there are times that women can't breastfeed, and so we need to take this into consideration. You can see a 1 to 3 year old needs 150 micrograms. And when you see what that means in the way of leafy greens, there's no way that any 1 to 3 year old is getting 150 micrograms. An adult, so essentially over the age of 14, we need 400 micrograms a day. And in pregnancy, you can see that increases to 600 micrograms. So that is a lot of folate a day. And we are talking about the correct form of folate, obviously. So here's a list off the government website that shows you sources of folate and folic acid. And the folic acid is obviously with this cross, which means it's been fortified. So the breakfast cereals, the rice, What else? Oops, what else is fortified here? The bread, obviously. But have a look. Half a cup of spinach is 131 micrograms. Now, if you go back and you have a look at a 1-year-old, 150 micrograms, even a half a cup of spinach, which no one from the age of 1 to 3 would probably be having, they're still not getting enough. So it is important that we understand that there is a fair amount that we need to achieve to get into you to allow you to have your 500 micrograms in preconception. And that's why I would suggest in preconception and pregnancy, you really need to be taking a supplement. You cannot rely, particularly if you have the MTHFR gene, you cannot rely on food alone. So the foods also, other foods rich in folate are these. Keep in mind that your leafy greens are the most important. So let's have a look at your daily allowance. 400 micrograms. You would need half a cup of boiled spinach, 4 spears of asparagus, a cup of lettuce, half an avocado, half a cup of broccoli, and half a cup of kidney beans for you to achieve 400 micrograms. And I would say that most of you would not be getting anything like 400 micrograms. So yes, we need to get in our leafy greens as much as we possibly can, but in preconception and pregnancy, we must be taking a supplement with active form of folate. So your key action steps are going to be: 1, read every single label. Avoid the food if it says folate or folic acid. Better still, if you want cakes and biscuits and breads, either buy organic or make your own, because then at least you know what you're getting and you can avoid the folic acid fairly easily. Eat as fresh as possible. Go to the growers markets. If you can eat organic, eat organic. Grow your own, whatever it takes for you to be able to have access to the leafy green veggies. Avoid all supplements that say folic acid or don't specify. If it just says folate, then don't assume that that's fine, because folic acid and folate are intertwined all the time. So I would be very suspicious if it does not say the form of folate. And make sure you're getting your folate in your food every day and at every meal. And in preconception and pregnancy, you need to be supplementing as well. So thank you so much for joining me today. We have lots more for you. So jump onto MTHFRfertility.com. You can email us hello@mthfrfertility.com, and we also have an MTHFR Fertility Facebook group. So please, any questions or comments or further information, you can also find out about my preconception course on that website, which is basically everything I know on how to prepare you for pregnancy if you have the MTHFR gene. And I would go so far as to say it doesn't matter if you have the MTHFR gene. This is essentially the best way to prepare for pregnancy. So thanks again. Really enjoyed having you here, and I look forward to speaking to you soon. Bye for now.